divorce papers were already signed by the time Isolde found out what her husband had done with the house. Not the house they lived in together, the one on Clearwater Terrace in Oakville, with the bay window she had spent 2 weekends painting herself, because Callum said the contractor quote was too high. Not that house, the other one, the one her grandmother had left her. The one with the deed that still had her maiden name on it, Isolde Fenn, because she had never gotten around to changing it, and she was grateful for that now, in a way she could not have anticipated 3 years ago, when she and Callum were still the kind of couple who took weekend drives up to Muskoka and argued pleasantly about nothing. She found out on a Tuesday. She had gone to the bank to check the insurance paperwork on the Halliburton property, her grandmother's cottage, the one she had been renting out quietly since the year her grandmother passed, the one that had been generating a modest but steady income that Isolde had kept in a separate account because some part of her had always known, on some cellular level she could not name, that she might need it. And the woman at the bank, a pleasant woman named Sheila, who had handled her grandmother's estate years earlier, had looked at Isolde across the desk with an expression that said she was already deciding how much to say. What Sheila said was, there had been an inquiry. Several months ago, someone had contacted the registry office asking about the title, and then a second inquiry. And then, about 6 weeks before, Callum sat Isolde down in their kitchen on Clearwater Terrace and told her that he had not been happy for a long time and that there was someone else. He had retained a lawyer, not for the divorce, for the cottage. He had believed, or had been told to believe, that because they were married, the property was jointly held. He had been wrong about that. The title was clear, but he had still tried. Isolde sat in Sheila's office for a long time after that. She looked out the window at the parking lot. There was a woman loading groceries into a minivan. There was a dog tied to a post outside the pharmacy next door, a golden retriever, patient and unbothered by the cold. She thought about Callum's mother, Francine Aldridge, 67 years old, retired school administrator, who had been calling her son every Sunday for the entirety of their marriage, and whose opinion on what constituted a suitable wife had never once included Isolde Fenn. Francine had a friend whose daughter was a family law associate in Hamilton. Francine had mentioned this once at Christmas dinner, in the way that people say things when they want you to know something without saying it plainly. Isolde drove home. She did not call anyone. She had met Callum Aldridge at a company event 6 years earlier. She was 31 then, working as a senior analyst at a mid-sized investment advisory firm called Haverford Meridian. He was charming in the way that men who grew up with money are sometimes charming, not aggressively, not performatively, but with a kind of easy confidence that reads at first as warmth. He had laughed at things she said. He had remembered what she ordered. He had texted the next day, not 3 days later. They were engaged within 2 years. They were married in a small ceremony at a vineyard outside of Niagara-on-the-Lake. His mother wore a cream-colored suit and told Isolde, upon meeting her properly for the first time at the rehearsal dinner, that she had expected someone taller. She said it with a smile. Isolde had smiled back. The marriage was not bad exactly in the beginning. It was what a lot of marriages become before they become something else. A shared routine, a shared mortgage, a shared calendar on their phones that they consulted without speaking. Callum worked in commercial real estate. He did well. He had a partner, a man named Boyd, and together they ran a brokerage that was growing steadily and which required, according to Callum, a great deal of evening availability and weekend travel to conferences that Isolde was never invited to attend. She had asked once if she could come to one Calgary. March? He had said the accommodations were all arranged. It was a work thing. It wouldn't make sense. She had not asked again. The someone else turned out to be a woman named Simone, 29, who worked in marketing at a firm that shared a floor with Callum's brokerage. Isolde found this out not from Callum, but from a mutual acquaintance, weeks after the conversation in the kitchen, because Callum had said only that there was someone else and had not offered more than that. And Isolde had not asked because she was still processing the fact that her husband had tried to access her grandmother's property. Francine, she later learned, had met Simone at Easter, had invited her to the family cottage in Parry Sound, had apparently already begun referring to her informally in family group chats that Isolde had never been added to. Here is what Callum did not know about Isolde Fenn. He knew she was an analyst. He knew she was good at her job. He had attended her firm's holiday party 3 times and had spent each one talking to the senior partners about golf and commercial zoning, and had paid very little attention to what Isolde actually did in the hours she spent at that office. What she did in those hours was this. She had been quietly building a portfolio. It had started with the inheritance from her grandmother, not just the cottage, but a modest cash bequest that Isolde had invested carefully over 7 years, reinvesting returns, diversifying slowly, making choices she researched alone in the evenings when Callum was on his phone and the television was on in the background, and the apartment felt like a place two people happened to sleep rather than a home. She had a gift for reading markets that her grandmother, who had worked as a bookkeeper for 40 years, would have recognized and approved of. She was patient. She was not flashy. She did not discuss her personal finances with Callum because he had made a comment early in their marriage, not unkind but revealing. That investing was something you did after you'd secured real assets, and she had understood from that comment that they did not share a financial language. She had also, in the 18 months before the divorce papers appeared, begun quietly acquiring shares in a small real estate investment trust, a private one, not publicly traded, structured around a portfolio of commercial properties across southern Ontario. She had not set out to acquire it entirely. She had set out to invest sensibly in an undervalued vehicle that her analysis suggested was being mismanaged and was therefore underperforming. The REIT was called Folklore Consolidated. It held, among other things, a minority stake in a mixed-use development in downtown Burlington that was being managed under contract. The contractor on that development was Aldridge & Boyd Realty. She had not known this when she started buying in. She had found out approximately 4 months before Callum handed her the papers, when she had done a routine review of Folklore's underlying assets and cross-referenced the management contracts and seen the name. She had sat with that information for 4 months. She had said nothing. She had continued buying. The divorce itself was handled the way divorces are handled when one person has already decided and the other person is still trying to understand what happened. Callum had his lawyer. Isolde retained her own, a woman named Patricia Swan in Mississauga, who had a reputation for being thorough in ways that opposing counsel consistently underestimated. Francine called once during the proceedings. Isolde did not answer. Francine left a voicemail that was 3 minutes long, and which Isolde listened to twice, not because it contained anything surprising, but because she wanted to understand clearly the shape of what she had been living inside. The voicemail was about the family name, about what Callum deserved, about Simone, whom Francine described, without irony, as someone who understood what it meant to support a man's ambitions. There was a part near the end where Francine said that Isolde had always seemed more interested in her career than in building a family, and that this was perhaps nobody's fault. Isolde saved the voicemail. She forwarded it to Patricia. The settlement was finalized on a Thursday in March. It was not complicated. The cottage was not on the table. Patricia had made that clear in the first meeting, and opposing counsel had backed away from it with a speed that told Isolde they had known it was not a strong position. The house on Clearwater Terrace was sold. The proceeds were split. Callum kept his brokerage partnership. Isolde kept her accounts. What nobody at the signing table knew, nobody except Patricia, who knew because it was her job to know, was that 3 weeks earlier, Isolde had completed the acquisition that made her the majority shareholder of Folklore Consolidated. The annual review meeting of Folklore Consolidated's investor board was held the following month, in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building on Bay Street in Toronto. It was a routine meeting: governance, Q1 performance, management contracts up for renewal. Isolde had attended Folklore board meetings before as a minority investor and had sat quietly and asked precise questions and been regarded by the men who ran the room with a particular brand of polite inattention that competent women in financial boardrooms will recognize without requiring explanation. This meeting was different. She had not announced the change in her ownership position publicly. The paperwork was filed correctly and completely. Patricia had ensured that, but there had been no press release, no formal notification to the management teams of the underlying assets. This was legal. This was also deliberate. Callum was not at the meeting. He was not on the investor board, but Boyd was. Boyd had a small personal stake in Folklore that he had acquired 2 years earlier through a contact of Callum's, and he attended these meetings as a matter of habit, partly to maintain the relationship, and partly because Boyd had always liked the idea of being in rooms where decisions were made. Boyd arrived first. He nodded at Isolde, with the mild, unregistered recognition of someone who has met a person several times without ever bothering to learn what they do. He poured himself a coffee. He checked his phone. The board chair, a man named Hargrove, called the meeting to order and worked through the standard items. When he reached the agenda item for management contract renewals, he paused in the way that people pause when they have received information that has changed their preparation. He said, before they proceeded, he wanted to acknowledge that there had been a change in the shareholder composition that the board should be aware of. Boyd looked up from his phone. Hargrove said that as of 3 weeks prior, Brentholo Consolidated had a new majority shareholder. He said her name. He said the percentage. Boyd set down his coffee cup. He looked at his old. She met his eyes. She said nothing for a moment. She let the number sit in the room. Then Hargrove, who was conducting a meeting and had items to get through, asked if there were any questions from the floor regarding the management contract renewal for the Burlington development before they moved to a vote. Boyd said, "Wait." He said Callum's brokerage had held that contract for 2 years. He said they had a relationship with Brentholo. He said this. He stopped. He looked at Isolde again. He said her name, but like a question. She opened the folder in front of her. She said that she had reviewed the performance metrics on the Burlington development, and that the returns were below the benchmark for comparable contracts in the region by approximately 11%, and that she had prepared a summary for the board, which she passed down the table. Boyd said that Callum didn't. He stopped again. He said she was the majority shareholder. She said yes. He said since when? She said 3 weeks ago. But the analysis she was presenting covered the last 22 months. The vote on the contract renewal was not close. Callum called that evening. She let it go to voicemail, the way she had let his mother's call go to voicemail, and for some of the same reasons. She listened to it once. He did not sound angry, which surprised her. He sounded something closer to stunned, in the way that people sound when the world has revealed a shape they had not been able to perceive when they were standing too close to it. He said her name. He said he didn't know. He said, and here his voice did something she had not heard it do in the last 2 years of their marriage. He said he guessed he hadn't paid enough attention. She deleted the voicemail, not from anger. There was very little anger left by then. She deleted it because it did not contain anything she needed to keep. Francine did not call. Simone, she heard later through the mutual acquaintance, had been under the impression that Callum's business was doing extremely well. The Burlington contract had been their largest. Boyd, from what Patricia's contacts reported, was reconsidering the partnership structure. These were not things Isolde had engineered. They were simply the natural consequences of metrics that had always been true, and a contract that had always been renewable. The cottage in Halliburton reopened in May the way it always did. The same week the ice went out on the lake. Isolde drove up on a Friday afternoon after work, windows down on the 400, radio on. She had packed enough for the weekend and nothing more because she had learned, in the past year, to stop planning further than she could see clearly. The porch needed painting. She had known this for 2 seasons and had not done it because there had always been something else. The marriage, the proceedings, the board filings, the months of sitting quietly with information that she had not yet needed to use. She sat on the unpainted porch that evening with a cup of tea and looked at the lake, which was flat and grey-green in the early May light, the way it always was before the summer colors came in. A loon called somewhere to the left. The sound carried across the water and disappeared. Her grandmother had sat on this porch. Her grandmother had told her, more than once, that patience was not passivity, that knowing when to be still was not the same as having nothing to say. Her grandmother had also told her that a woman who understands her own name on a piece of paper is a woman nobody can move without her knowing it. She had not fully understood that at 19, sitting on this same porch while her grandmother drank her evening tea and spoke in the unhurried way of someone who has already survived most of what the world can offer. She understood it now. The lake was quiet. The loon called again, closer this time, and then went still. Isolde set down her cup, leaned back in the chair that had been her grandmother's chair, and let the evening come in around her without rushing it. There was no one she needed to call. There was nothing left to wait for. The name on the deed had always been hers.